It started like any other ordinary weekend. My husband, Chris, had plans to head out of town for a fishing trip with some of his colleagues. It wasn't the first time he'd been away for a few days, and I was more than used to managing the house on my own. Michael might stop by while I'm gone, Chris said casually over breakfast that Friday. Michael, I repeated, a little surprised. Chris's best friend was a regular presence in our lives, but it wasn't like him to drop by unannounced when Chris wasn't home. Yeah, he said, sipping his coffee. He's got some paperwork to sort out with me, but I told him he could leave it here if he couldn't. Wait until I'm back. I nodded, not thinking much of it. Michael had been in Chris's life long before I came into the picture. They'd gone to college together, played on the same sports teams, and even worked at the same company for a few years before Michael ventured into his own business. He was charming, confident, and always carried a certain magnetism that made people gravitate toward him. He day passed quietly. I spent most of it tidying up and catching up on work. By evening, the house felt unusually quiet without Chris. That's when the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, there he was. Michael, dressed in his usual smart, casual style, holding a folder under one arm and a bottle of wine in the other. Hey, he greeted with that easy smile. Hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all, I said, stepping aside to let him in. I brought this, he said, handing me the wine. Figured you might want some company tonight. I hesitated, unsure of whether to accept. Oh, you didn't have to. Chris isn't here, though. I know, he interrupted, setting the folder down on the coffee table. But I thought I'd keep you company for a bit, if that's okay. I couldn't exactly say no without seeming rude, so I nodded sure. Let me get some glasses. As I poured the wine, Michael made himself comfortable on the couch. He looked around the living room with a nostalgic smile. This place hasn't changed much since the last time I was here. Chris likes to keep things simple, I said, handing him a glass. We sat across from each other, the conversation flowing easily. Michael had always been a good storyteller, and before I knew it, I was laughing at his anecdotes about their college days. He had a way of making even the simplest memories sound like grand adventures. But as the evening wore on, the atmosphere began to shift. It was subtle at first, a lingering glance here, a compliment there. You know, Michael said, swirling the wine in his glass. Chris is a lucky guy. You've done so much to make this house feel like a home. I felt my cheeks flush. That's kind of you to say. I mean it, he insisted, leaning forward slightly. You have a way of making people feel comfortable, like they belong. I tried to laugh it off, but the intensity in his gaze made my pulse quicken. It's getting late, I said, abruptly standing up to clear the glasses. Michael stood as well, his movements deliberate. I didn't mean to overstay, he said, his voice softer now. As he gathered his things, I walked him to the door, my heart pounding for reasons I didn't want to name. Good night, Michael, I said, hoping to put an end to whatever unspoken tension was hanging in the air. Good night, he replied, holding my gaze for just a moment, too long before stepping out into the night. I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. But deep down I knew this wasn't the end of it. The next day I tried to focus on my routine and push the previous night out of my mind. But no matter how much I distracted myself, the memory of Michael's lingering gaze stayed with me. It was an unspoken tension, subtle but undeniable. Around noon, as I was folding laundry, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Michael. Thanks for letting me stop by last night. Hope I didn't keep you up too late. I stared at the message, unsure how to respond. After a few moments, I typed back, Not at all, it was nice. Catching up, hope you have a good day. His reply came almost instantly. You too, Let me know if you need anything while Chris is out. I set the phone down, brushing off the unease. Michael was just being polite. I told myself there was no reason to overanalyze it. The day passed without incident. But as evening fell, I found myself checking the driveway more often than I cared to admit. Part of me wondered if Michael would show up again unannounced. But the hours dragged on, and the doorbell stayed silent. It wasn't until the next morning that I saw him again. I was watering the plants in the front yard. When his car pulled into the driveway, he stepped out holding a paper bag and 2 coffee cups. "Morning," he called out with a smile. "Thought I'd bring you some breakfast." I hesitated, unsure whether to accept his gesture. But as he approached, his friendly demeanor put me at ease. "You didn't have to do that," I said, taking the coffee he offered. "I figured you might appreciate it," he said with a shrug. "Besides, I needed an excuse to get out of the house." We sat on the porch eating croissants and sipping coffee. The conversation was light at first, but as the minutes passed, it took on a more personal tone. "Do you ever feel lonely when Chris is gone?" he asked suddenly, catching me off guard. I took a sip of coffee to buy myself some time sometimes. I admitted, but I'm used to it. His work keeps him busy. Michael nodded thoughtfully. I get it, relationships can be complicated. There was something in his voice, a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. It made me curious, even though I knew I shouldn't be. "What about you?" I asked cautiously. "You've never settled down." He chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "I guess I haven't found the right person." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with an unspoken understanding. "You're lucky," he said finally, his gaze meeting mine. "Chris is a good man." "Yes, he is," I said quickly, hoping to steer the conversation back to safer ground. But as the morning wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's visit wasn't just about breakfast. There was something else, something he wasn't saying. When he finally left, I watched his car disappear down the street, my heart heavy with questions I didn't want to ask. By the 3rd day, I found myself unusually restless. Chris's absence felt heavier than it usually did, and Michael's unexpected visits had only added to my unease. I told myself it was nothing, just harmless conversations with a friend of my husband. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the whole truth. That evening, as I was preparing dinner, the doorbell rang. I hesitated before answering, already knowing who it would be. Sure enough, Michael stood on the porch, a casual smile on his face and a bottle of wine in hand. "Thought I'd stop by and check in," he said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. "Michael," I began, trying to sound firm but polite. "It's late and I'm cooking." He finished peering past me into the house. "It smells great. Mind if I join you?" I opened my mouth to protest, but he was already stepping inside. "Michael, I'll just set the table," he said, flashing a grin that disarmed me completely. Before I knew it, we were sitting across from each other at the dining table, the soft glow of the overhead light casting a warm ambiance. Michael was charming as always, his stories and wit making it impossible not to laugh. But as the evening wore on, I started to notice the subtle shifts again, the way his eyes lingered on mine, the slight touch of his hand as he passed the salt. "You're really something, you know that," he said suddenly, his voice softer than before. "What do you mean?" I asked, my pulse quickening. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Chris is lucky to have you. You're smart, kind, beautiful. You make people feel like they belong." I froze, unsure how to respond. His words felt like a confession, and I didn't know whether to be flattered or alarmed. "Michael, I think you should go." I said, finally standing up to clear the plates. But he didn't move. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said softly. "You didn't, I lied." Pulling my hand away, "But this isn't right." He nodded, standing up and stepping back. "You're right, I'm sorry." As I walked into the door, I couldn't help but notice the sadness in his eyes. For a moment, I almost reached out, almost said something to ease the tension. But I didn't. "Good night, Michael," I said firmly, closing the door behind him. I leaned against the door, my heart pounding this time. There was no denying it. Something had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy weight on my chest. The events of the previous night played over and over in my mind. Michael's words, his gaze, the way his presence seemed to linger even after he'd left. It all felt like a storm I couldn't shake. I resolved to keep busy throwing myself into chores and errands. But no matter how much I tried, my thoughts always circled back to Michael. Was I overthinking it, or was there really something there? Something neither of us had the courage to acknowledge. By late afternoon, I decided to step out for some air. As I walked down the street, I spotted Michael's car parked a few houses away. My heart sank. He was here again. When I returned home, I found him sitting on the porch steps, his head in his hands. "Michael," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "What are you doing here?" He looked up, and the vulnerability in his eyes caught me off guard. "I just needed to talk to someone," he said. I hesitated, torn between frustration and concern. Finally, I sighed and unlocked the door. "Come inside." We sat in the living room, the silence between us stretching uncomfortably. "I'm sorry for showing up like this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make things complicated." "You didn't," I lied again, though we both knew the truth. "I think I did," he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "It's just you're different. You know, you're not like anyone I've ever met." "Michael, stop," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't fair to me, to you. To Chris." "I know," he said quickly. "I know it's wrong, but I can't help how I feel." His words hung in the air. Heavy and inescapable, I stood up, pacing the room as I tried to collect my thoughts. "Michael," I began, turning to face him. "You're a good man, but this can't happen. Whatever you're feeling, you need to let it go." He nodded, his expression pained. "You're right. I just needed to say it out loud to get it out of my system." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to comfort him, to ease his pain. But I knew any gesture could be misinterpreted. "I think you should leave," I said finally, my voice firm but kind. He stood, his shoulders slumped. "I'm sorry," he said again, heading for the door as he stepped outside. He paused and turned back to me. "Take care of yourself, okay?" "You too," I said, closing the door behind him. For the first time in days, the house felt quiet again. I leaned against the door, exhaling deeply. Whatever had almost happened between us was over now. But the impact of it lingered. When Chris returned that evening, I hugged him tighter than I ever had before. He looked at me with a puzzled smile. "Miss me that much?" "You have no idea," I said, my voice steady but my heart still heavy with the weight of what I'd almost allowed to happen. As the days passed, Michael's visit stopped and life returned to normal. But every now and then I caught myself thinking about that weekend, about the boundaries we almost crossed, and the consequences that could have followed. Sometimes the greatest battles we face are the ones within ourselves. And that weekend I'd won, though, not without scars, without